Charles Hanley of the Associated Press. The ad hoc working group here, which is considering the future for the Kyoto Protocol ratifying nations, has endorsed a 25 to 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2020. Now that would be among the richer nations, the Kyoto nations. Is this a sure path to a 50% worldwide reduction that you are talking about by 2050? And perhaps in connection with that, you could discuss, this was a 4-month process. Were these numbers in disagreement during those 4 months? Thank you.
There are scientists around who really would advocate even deeper emissions. And if you look at the text of the Bali Declaration, we're saying things like at least 50% reductions by 2050. The word at least appears several times in the declaration, so I'll say that up front. And it's a very good question you ask, because we're talking about minimising the risk of dangerous climate change. There is evidence that the trajectory we're on is already subjecting the planet to a very good chance. We talk about this threshold of 2 degrees Celsius. With some of the emissions trajectories we're advocating, we're only actually giving ourselves an even money chance of actually avoiding that 2 degree C threshold. This term dangerous climate change is there in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, Article 2, and yes, it's a difficult thing to quantify as a scientist. You know, what does dangerous exactly mean? But clearly, the lower the emissions trajectories we subject the planet to, the lower the chance of reaching these dangerous thresholds of climate change. Next question, my friend. And then if we could have a microphone down to keep things going down to that.
Hello, this is Judy Soul from Worldwide Africa Productions in South Africa. Basically, the apocalyptic scenario that has been described by the scientific report is still really not very, I think it's a very good moment to give some idea of it, since we have got the international press here. Would you be able to give some idea of the time scale that you think if we did nothing? And the second question is, if you were to be able to decide without having to have consensus, would you at this moment in time, bearing in mind that you have children, be worried enough to say, let's think about changing the economics of this country and move away from this fixation of economic growth at all costs?
Look to my panelists to see if put up their hands, but I'm happy to talk to Andy.
I don't see, if you're referring to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, I don't see this as apocalyptic. They present a range of impacts at global scales that are very serious and very much requiring major global intervention to keep the emissions down so we stabilise at 450 parts per million equivalent. But I don't think they're the level of doom and gloom scenarios that have sometimes been advocated in the press. They're very serious, that's why we're here to find this declaration, but I don't think it's very helpful to describe them in those terms.
A question for Professor Pitman. In the press materials here, you say that if we can stabilise below 450 parts per million, we may prevent dangerous climate change. Can you say a little bit more about that word "may"? And secondly, given the kind of cuts that you're asking for, when would you expect that stabilisation target to be reached? At what point would we be stabilising at 450 parts per million? Thank you.
I can answer the first question. The evidence we have at the moment suggests that if we stabilise at 450 parts per million equivalent, we have about a 50% chance of keeping the global mean temperature to below 2 degrees. So that's a really confronting statement, that if we can stabilise at 450 equivalent, we have a 50-50 chance of avoiding dangerous anthropogenic climate change. There is a graph on the screen that you can see there. Most of you would recognise the red lines towards the top of the graph. Those are the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change emission scenarios. The green line presents us a 75% chance of keeping global climate change to less than 2 degrees. That requires stabilization at 400 parts per million equivalent. The yellow lines, which gives us a 50% chance of avoiding dangerous anthropogenic change, require stabilization at the 450. That's the number we've chosen, giving us a 50-50 chance. Therefore, some people have declined to sign this declaration on the grounds that we need to cut much more deeply than the 450 that we put in this declaration. But the stabilization at 450 equivalent gives us a 50-50 chance, which is a major step forward, I think.
And just to answer, the one other part is we're looking at 10 to 15 years to get to that point of stabilization.
John Angleby from the Financial Times in London. A couple of questions. One, do the politicians not get it? Or why do you need to be here? Do they need more pushing? Or sort of, I'm just wondering what your attitude towards the politicians and bureaucrats is, and how engaged and on your message they are. And secondly, about technology, how much of these emissions do you feel that can come from technology, sort of the American approach, and technology transfer, etc., and how much needs to come from lifestyle changes in anyone and everyone across the world?
I'll volunteer the first question. I'll hand to a panelist for the second. You know, the politicians have a difficult task in some sense. They get handed documents that are very long, and there are long reports out there that do. I agree with you. They set out clearly some of the implications of doing nothing about this problem, and those reports should have traction. And reports like the IPCC are absolutely the premier reports on climate change that we have. What this declaration about is delivering a clear message. It's only 4 or 5 paragraphs long. It's got the weight of the scientific community behind it, and hopefully it's going to help the negotiators here in the next few weeks in Bali remember what the climate scientists are saying. I'll hand to one of the panelists for the technology question.
We're speaking here about a topic that's hard for the public and maybe some politicians to grasp, which is that we're speaking about risk, we're speaking about probabilities and likelihoods. There isn't a magic number, just as there's no magic cholesterol number that a physician can give you below which you're safe and above which you're going to have a heart attack. It's simply a risk factor, and it's our judgment and that of the signatories that the targets we've outlined are the ones needed to keep that risk within reasonable bounds.
Many climate scientists in Europe are now being asked to brief major corporations on the science, and so I agree with you that scientists now are being asked to inform not just governments but private sector and other groups that are very concerned about climate change.
So I've got one here, then one over there, then yes.
Lucy Carney, Associated Press Television News. What impact has the Australian government ratifying Kyoto this week had on climate change, and what are your thoughts about that?
Look, I should say up front, it had no impact on this climate declaration. We prepared this 4 months ago. I've got to say, before coming to this meeting, I was contemplating the large differences that would be in place with a change of government, but this declaration came about totally independently of the Australian situation, and it's about setting targets for the whole planet and so on. I forget whether you had a second question there as well.
What are your thoughts about how that will impact on climate change now they have ratified?
Look, the fact that there was applause when that was ratified, I think, speaks volumes for what that move is. But really, the Bali Declaration is a scientific statement about where we see the emissions targets as needing to go. And this graph up here is actually, sets out quite plainly and alarmingly that we need to come way below some of these even nice, so-called nice and aggressive scenarios the IPCC have laid out there on those red curves and come down below that.
I think I can add to that a little bit. I think we applaud every effort to reduce emissions, but one of the things that we as scientists want to make clear to negotiators, to you, and through you to the great numbers of people whom you reach, is that these issues are quantitative. And Kyoto itself, if everyone signed today and nobody cheated, still only reduces slightly. We need a much larger emissions. Everyone at the beginning of the Kyoto process realized that it was a beginning, it wasn't the final statement. And here we're saying simply that emissions have continued on the wrong trajectory. CO2 emissions, to give you a number, between 1970 and 2004 rose by 80%, 80%, rose, going in the wrong direction. They continue to rise. And that for stabilization of the climate, we require drastic cuts in emissions. That's just a quantitative fact. And so when negotiators are ready to take this issue seriously enough to deal with these kinds of numbers, that's when climate science comes to the aid of the process, because the science is now advanced far enough and the confidence in the science is increased enough so that we can be very helpful in talking about the kinds of numbers that need to be arrived at.
Clearly a lot of the solutions are already there, technologies, renewable energies. There's no silver bullet, but the clear statement we want to make today are these bullet points about our emissions futures and what the scientists see as the means of giving our best chance of avoiding dangerous climate change.
We also recognise that we need to be able to adapt as science gives us more insight and as the planet gives us more insight into what's happening. So what we're saying today is our best judgment on the science that we have at the moment. I do believe that in 10 or 20 years we may need to adapt these targets. But the temperature target, in terms of impacts on humanity, it's a lot easier to think through what a temperature target means in terms of dangerous climate change, for example.
Mark, did you say that?
I just want to add that, so that we're clear, what we're advocating is the agreement that emerges from this process that we expect to be signed in Copenhagen reflects the numbers that we're suggesting. And the point that Diana Lieberman just made is that as the science gets better, those numbers may need to be revised, but those are the best numbers today. We expect to see these reflected, these types of targets reflected directly in the text. Thank you.
Okay, yeah.
Hi, David Fogarty from Reuters. Just one quick question. The fact that so many climate scientists feel compelled to come make such a strong statement today, do you think that underscores that the scientists involved in the IPCC process were kind of felt constrained by the political agenda or the political objectives, that they couldn't come out and make an even stronger statement?
A lot of people want to answer that question. I'll hand to Richard and then Andy straight away.
I would like to answer that question directly. I'm a coordinating lead author for Working Group 1 of this year's IPCC report, and like every signer, I signed as an individual. I have no fault to find with IPCC. I reject the characterization of it as political. It was a marvelous, constructive, harmonious procedure with true attention paid really only to the standards of science and scientific integrity. What we're seeing in this declaration is a group of scientists who accept the IPCC report, who agree with its assessment of the science, and are now doing something that IPCC simply doesn't do, that's outside its charge. And the signers here are advocating policy objectives, which IPCC does not do. So they're really quite distinct, and there's no controversy, there's no conflict between the Bali Declaration and anything that is in any IPCC report.
Thank you so much for coming along today. This has been a lot of work in the making, and we're glad for the interest in the declaration. Thank you.